It is May 2026. A cruise ship is stranded in the Atlantic Ocean. 3 people are dead. Passengers are being airlifted to hospitals across 6 countries. A Harvard professor is going on national television to say the official government messaging contradicts what the science actually shows. And the doctors treating the survivors have one tool available to them: a ventilator. And hope. No antiviral drug. No approved vaccine. No specific treatment of any kind. The CDC's own website, updated this week, says the official medical response to hantavirus is rest, hydration, and breathing support for a virus with a 38% mortality rate. So, before you get comfortable, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find this worth knowing. Now let's get into it. Now here is the question nobody in the government wants to answer directly. In May 2020, exactly 6 years ago, the United States launched something called Operation Warp Speed. The federal government wrote an $18 billion check. They ran clinical trials simultaneously instead of sequentially. They signed manufacturing contracts before they even knew if the vaccines worked. And in 9 months, the fastest vaccine development in the history of medicine, they had multiple approved COVID vaccines in people's arms. 9 months. $18 billion. Problem solved. Hantavirus was first identified in the United States in 1993, 33 years ago. It has killed over 800 Americans since then. It is killing people on a cruise ship right now. There is still no treatment. There is still no approved vaccine. So the question is not whether the government knows how to move fast on a virus. They prove they do. The question is why they didn't. And the answer is documented. That's exactly what we're going to find out today, right here on Pharma Facts. To understand the gap, we first need to understand what Operation Warp Speed actually was, because there is a common misconception. People assume the COVID vaccines were developed so fast because safety steps were skipped. They were not. The speed came from one specific decision. Normally, vaccine development follows a strict sequence. You finish one phase of clinical trials. You wait for the results. You start the next phase. Each step waits for the previous one to finish. That process, done sequentially, takes an average of 10 to 15 years. Operation Warp Speed ran everything simultaneously. Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3 trials, all running at the same time. Manufacturing was being scaled up before the trials were even finished. The government signed contracts to buy hundreds of millions of doses before a single vaccine had been proven to work. If the vaccine failed, the doses would be thrown away. The government ate the financial risk, so the pharmaceutical companies didn't have to. That is the key mechanism. The government took on the financial risk that private companies would never accept on their own. The result, documented by The Lancet, the Federation of American Scientists, and congressional reports, was the most effective government-led research program in a generation. First vaccines approved in 9 months. Fastest in history by years. The previous record, before Operation Warp Speed, was 4 years. So the science of moving fast is understood. The mechanism is documented. The blueprint exists. Now let's go back to 1993. Spring. Four Corners region. Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah. Young, previously healthy people are dying. Acute fever. Influenza-like symptoms. Then rapid progression to pulmonary failure. The lungs fill with fluid. The heart collapses. Federal and state health workers mobilize with remarkable speed. In less than 3 weeks, the CDC task force has identified the virus. By November of that year, they have isolated and cultured it. They name it Sin Nombre virus, Spanish for no name. The disease is called Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. 56% of that year's cases in America were fatal. And then, the world moved on. Hantavirus was rare. It mostly hit rural populations in the American Southwest. Hunters, farmers, people who cleaned out sheds or barns where deer mice had been living. The average annual case count in the U.S. settled at around 30 to 40 people per year. 30 to 40 people. Not enough to justify the investment. Not enough of a market. So no treatment was built. No vaccine was prioritized. For 30 years. Here's where the story takes a turn that rarely gets reported. NBC News confirmed this week, in direct reporting on the current outbreak, that developing a hantavirus vaccine would take a decade or more without a federal push comparable to Operation Warp Speed. A decade. Without the push. So the question is, why has that push never happened? A professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health gave the answer plainly, on the record, in current reporting on this outbreak. She said, "Our funding agencies don't put a lot of money into this because it's likely not to cause the next epidemic or pandemic." Read that again. Funding decisions are made based on whether a disease is likely to cause an epidemic, not based on the mortality rate, not based on whether a treatment exists, based on whether it will spread widely enough to become a political problem. Hantavirus kills roughly 38% of the people who develop serious illness. That is a higher mortality rate than most diseases that receive major federal research funding. But it kills them quietly, in rural areas, in small numbers, mostly in poorer countries in South America. That calculation, likely not to cause the next pandemic, is the documented reason the money was never spent. And then it gets worse. In 2025, the Trump administration cut funding to a research group that had been actively studying the specific type of hantavirus now killing people on a cruise ship. The program was called the Western Atlantic Center for Excellence in Infectious Diseases, part of a broader NIH network called Centers for Research in Emerging Infectious Diseases. It was specifically designed to study viruses capable of jumping from animals to people, including the Andes strain of hantavirus. According to records compiled by Grant Witness, a database tracking eliminated federal grants, the NIH's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases had originally committed over $8.3 million to this program. At the time the funding was cut in 2025, almost $2.4 million of that had not yet been dispersed. It was eliminated as part of a broader pullback of federal infectious disease funding. Virologists working on the program said publicly at the time that there was no evidence their work was unsafe. The funding was simply cut. 1 year later, the Andes virus is on a cruise ship in the Atlantic. 3 people are dead, and there is no treatment. Now here is the number that puts all of this into scale. Operation Warp Speed. $18 billion. 9 months. Multiple approved vaccines. The FDA's entire Orphan Products Grant Program, the fund specifically responsible for developing treatments for rare diseases that the private market won't touch, is budgeted at $14 million per year. Not $14 billion. $14 million. The Federation of American Scientists has noted that this program has been declining in real buying power for 15 years. $14 million is less than the annual lobbying budget of a mid-sized pharmaceutical company. It is less than the annual bonus of a major pharmaceutical CEO. It is the entire federal budget for developing treatments for diseases that private industry has decided are not profitable enough to cure. Hantavirus lives in that budget. Or rather, it doesn't. To be fair, and the data requires fairness, vaccine candidates for hantavirus do exist. A small early-stage trial of an Andes virus vaccine produced a strong immune response without major safety concerns. ABC News reported this week that researchers described it as promising. Scientists at Albert Einstein College of Medicine said a number of vaccine candidates are in early development. But early development is not approval. And approval is not distribution. The reason it has stalled, documented by every expert quoted in current reporting, is the same reason it has always stalled. Outbreaks are sporadic. Cases are geographically scattered. The disease disproportionately affects poorer countries in South America, where the financial return on a vaccine is lowest. Running the large-scale efficacy trials required for FDA approval costs hundreds of millions of dollars. Without government funding to take on that risk, the way Operation Warp Speed took on the financial risk for COVID, private companies will not move. The science is not the barrier. The science has been moving, slowly, on $14 million a year. The barrier is the decision about which lives are worth the investment. Here is the number to carry with you. $18 billion. 9 months. A global pandemic that affected every country, every economy, every household on Earth. And the government moved. $14 million a year. 33 years. A virus with a 38% mortality rate and no approved treatment. And the government did not. The difference between those two numbers is not a scientific calculation. It is a political one. It is a calculation about which threats are large enough, visible enough, and politically costly enough to justify emergency action. And hantavirus, for 33 years, did not clear that bar. The people dying on a cruise ship in the Atlantic, right now did not clear that bar. That is not an opinion. That is what the Johns Hopkins professor said on the record, what the NBC News reporting confirmed, what the NIH funding cuts documented, and what 33 years of case data shows. In 1993, the government identified hantavirus in 3 weeks. In 2020, the government built a vaccine for a novel coronavirus in 9 months. In 2025, the government cut the last active federal research program, studying the strain of hantavirus, now killing people on a cruise ship. In 2026, the doctors treating those patients have a ventilator and a prayer. The capability was always there. Operation Warp Speed proved that. The question was never whether the government could move fast enough. The question was whether they would. And for 33 years, for hantavirus, the answer was no. This channel exists to follow the data, trace the money, and explain exactly how these decisions get made in plain English, without the spin. If that is the kind of story you want to understand, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.